It is March 6, 1945, in the shattered streets of Cologne, Germany. An experimental American heavy tank, the T-26E3 Pershing, nicknamed Eagle 7, advances cautiously toward the city's towering cathedral. Inside, Corporal Clarence Smoyer peers through his gun sights. Moments earlier, 2 American M4 Shermans were ambushed by a heavy German Panther. Now, the Pershing creeps into the open intersection, and the American driver sees a terrifying sight. The Panther is waiting, its long gun barrel rotating directly toward them. With no time to halt and calculate a perfect firing solution, the driver pushes into the square to avoid becoming a stationary target. Smoyer fires the massive 90mm weapon on the move. 3 armor-piercing shells slam into the formidable German tank, erupting it into flames. This cinematic duel, captured on film by a combat cameraman, seems to answer a fundamental question. What actually made an American tank deadly during the Second World War? If we judge purely by this encounter, the deadliest tank is simply the one with the thickest armor and the biggest gun. But a technical specification chart cannot reveal the entirety of armored warfare. It cannot show which tank would survive a grinding 500-mile advance across a continent, or which damaged vehicle could be patched together by field mechanics and sent back into combat the next morning. Through a comprehensive historical investigation, this documentary will rank the top 5 deadliest American tanks of the Second World War. We will explore how completely different environments, from the open deserts of North Africa to the rotting jungles of the Pacific, demanded entirely different definitions of lethality. For audiences seeking carefully researched stories from the Second World War, subscribe to Live 8 WW2, where we examine the historical evidence behind these battlefield legends. In this ranking, deadliest does not mean a simple kill count, which is historically impossible to verify given the chaos of combat, duplicate claims, and battlefield recovery. Instead, deadliest means overall combat effectiveness and operational impact. We are evaluating the total weapon system. This includes anti-armor firepower, but equally weighs high explosive capability against infantry and bunkers, tactical mobility, and crew survivability. Crucially, we factor in mechanical reliability, ease of maintenance, and the capacity for mass production. Ultimately, we are searching for the armored vehicles that exerted the greatest strategic influence across a global war, projecting power wherever the Allied armies needed them most. To understand why the first contender occupies its position, the analysis must temporarily leave the European theater entirely and look to the Pacific, where the environment itself was often the most dangerous enemy. Number 5 is the LVT-A amphibious tank. Often referred to as the monster from the sea, this highly specialized vehicle was born out of a desperate tactical problem. During the Pacific Island hopping campaigns, the United States military was forced to conduct relentless amphibious assaults against heavily fortified Japanese positions. Many of these volcanic islands and coral atolls were surrounded by shallow, jagged reefs. Standard wooden or steel landing craft could not cross these submerged reefs, leaving assault infantry stranded in the water, highly vulnerable to interlocking fields of Japanese machine gun and artillery fire. Conversely, standard medium tanks, if offloaded too far from the beach, would simply sink to the bottom of the ocean. The solution evolved from the landing vehicle tracked, a civilian machine originally designed as a rescue vehicle for traversing the swamps of the Florida Everglades. Military engineers realized that if this tracked, naturally buoyant vehicle was covered in armor plate and fitted with a fully rotating tank turret, it could bridge the deadly gap between the deep-water troopships and the contested shore. Armed with a turret taken from a light tank or a short-barreled 75mm howitzer, the LVT-A, designating landing vehicle tracked armored, became a true amphibious tank. These massive vehicles could swim from the naval staging areas, using their specialized cup-like tracks to churn the ocean water for propulsion. As they reached the coral reefs, instead of stopping, their tracks gripped the jagged surface, and the vehicles crawled directly out of the surf and onto the hostile beaches. Once on land, the LVT-A provided immediate heavy fire support to the exposed Marines and infantry. They could advance directly on Japanese pillboxes and bunkers, delivering high-explosive shells at point-blank range in environments where deploying standard artillery or conventional medium tanks was physically impossible. The primary limitation of the LVTA was inherent in its amphibious design requirements. In order to remain buoyant, it possessed a massive, box-like silhouette and relatively thin armor. Against heavy anti-tank weapons, or in a theoretical engagement with standard medium tanks, the LVTA was highly vulnerable. It was never intended to fight a sustained, cross-country armored war in Europe. However, against Japanese island fortifications, its lethality was unmatched precisely because it could reach locations no other armored vehicle could access. The LVTA earns its number 5 position because it solved an otherwise insurmountable strategic problem. Without the tank that swam, the amphibious assaults that broke the Japanese defensive perimeter would have incurred a catastrophic toll in American lives. The amphibious capability of the LVTA was essential for the Pacific, but it lacked the heavy armor and high-velocity firepower required for a sustained ground war against entrenched mechanized armies. The next vehicle on the ranking was designed to answer a desperate cry for heavy firepower, but its rushed design process resulted in one of the most awkward armored vehicles of the conflict. Number 4 is the M3 Lee, a vehicle also widely known in British Commonwealth service as the Grant. In the summer of 1940, the rapid fall of France under the weight of German blitzkrieg shocked the world. The United States Army suddenly realized that its existing M2 medium tanks, which were armed only with a light 37mm gun and festooned with machine guns, were hopelessly obsolete. Planners urgently demanded a medium tank capable of carrying a 75mm main gun, a weapon powerful enough to defeat modern German armor and deliver highly destructive explosive shells. There was just one massive engineering hurdle. At that time, American industrial plants simply did not possess the design experience or the manufacturing tooling required to cast a turret ring large enough to absorb the recoil of a 75mm weapon. To get a 75mm gun onto the battlefield immediately, engineers devised a mechanical stopgap solution. They took a large medium-velocity 75mm gun and mounted it in a sponson, a fixed casing set low into the right side of the tank's hull. They then placed a smaller, fully rotating turret on top of the hull, housing a high-velocity 37mm gun. Finally, on top of that, they added a small cupola for a machine gun. The resulting vehicle, the M3 Lee, looked utterly archaic. It stood a staggering 10 feet and 3 inches tall, creating a massive silhouette that was impossible to hide on a flat desert battlefield. Its hull was held together by rivets, which could snap off and become lethal projectiles inside the crew compartment if the tank was struck heavily by enemy fire. Worse still was the tactical limitation of its primary armament. Because the 75mm weapon was fixed in the hull, it possessed an extremely limited horizontal traverse. To track a moving target, the driver had to constantly pivot the entire 30-ton tank. Furthermore, because the heavy gun was mounted so low in the hull, the M3 Lee could not utilize a defensive hull-down position. To fire its primary weapon over a ridge, it had to drive forward and expose its entire towering, poorly sloped body to enemy gunners. Soviet tank crews who received the M3 through Lend-Lease programs strongly criticized its high profile, weak engine, and flammable rubber metal tracks, grimly nicknaming the vehicle a grave for 7 brothers, referencing its unusually large crew requirement. On paper, the M3 Lee appeared to be a disaster. In combat, however, it was an absolute revelation. When the British 8th Army received shipments of the modified M3 Grant variant, which featured a redesigned turret to house the radio, in early 1942, they rushed them to the North African desert. During the Battle of Gazala, British forces finally possessed a tank capable of engaging the enemy on equal terms. The American 75mm gun was a dual-purpose weapon. It fired an armor-piercing projectile at a velocity high enough to defeat the German Panzer III and Panzerabwehr tanks of the period beyond the range of standard German anti-tank guns. Crucially, it also fired a large high-explosive shell. British cruiser tanks of the period were armed mostly with 40mm guns that entirely lacked high-explosive ammunition, making them highly vulnerable to German-towed anti-tank positions. The M3 Grant could finally blast those lethal anti-tank positions into the sand. The German forces were so stunned by the sudden appearance of this heavily armed tank, which the British had meticulously disguised as transport lorries under canvas sunshields before the battle to maintain the element of surprise, that they respectfully referred to it as the pilot. The M3 Lee was an ugly duckling, a mechanical compromise pushed into service out of sheer industrial desperation. But it provided the crucial, heavy firepower the Allies needed to hold the line until superior, fully turreted designs could arrive. It ranks fourth because while its strategic impact in 1942 was profound, its tall silhouette, sponson-mounted gun, and riveted armor ultimately made it a tactical dead end. The M3 Lee was a towering, heavy stopgap that struggled to maneuver its main gun toward the enemy. The next vehicle on the ranking completely inverted that design philosophy. It traded heavy armor for unprecedented mobility, operating under the theory that speed is the ultimate defense. Number 3 is the M18 Hellcat. Officially classified as a tank destroyer rather than a conventional medium tank, the Hellcat was born from a unique and highly debated American military doctrine. Wartime planners theorized that standard medium tanks should primarily be used to support infantry, destroy fortifications, and exploit breakthroughs in the enemy line. If an enemy armored thrust occurred, commanders would deploy dedicated, highly mobile tank destroyer battalions to actively hunt and neutralize the threat. Introduced to the battlefield in 1944, the M18 Hellcat represented the absolute zenith of this doctrine, prioritizing velocity above all other considerations. It was not built on an existing medium tank hull. Instead, it utilized a specially designed, lightweight chassis powered by a robust radial aircraft engine. This combination made the M18 the fastest tracked armored vehicle in the United States arsenal, capable of reaching blistering speeds of up to 55 miles per hour on paved roads. To give it the necessary anti-armor bite, it was armed with a powerful 76mm high-velocity gun mounted in a fully traversable turret. But this incredible speed came with a severe, potentially fatal trade-off: crew protection. To keep the weight down to a bare minimum, the Hellcat was incredibly thin-skinned. Its armor could stop small arms fire and minor shrapnel, but little else. More dangerously, its turret was completely open at the top. While this gave the commander excellent visibility to spot targets across the battlefield, it left the 5-man crew highly vulnerable to artillery airbursts, mortar fire, and enemy infantry dropping grenades. Taking a direct hit from a heavy German tank was a virtual death sentence, making direct stand-up engagements extremely risky. If a Hellcat crew tried to slug it out with a Panther or a Tiger in a static frontal firefight, they would almost certainly lose. But in the hands of a skilled, aggressive crew, the Hellcat was devastating. Its speed allowed it to employ lethal hit-and-run tactics. During the bitter winter fighting of the Battle of the Bulge, the M18 used its unparalleled mobility to maneuver through the cratered terrain, outflanking heavier, slower German armor. A Hellcat would race to a firing position, strike the vulnerable, thinner side or rear armor of a German tank, and accelerate away before the heavy enemy turret could traverse to return fire. Despite its extreme physical vulnerability, the M18 Hellcat is credited with one of the highest kill-to-loss ratios of any American fighting vehicle of the war. It earns its number 3 spot by demonstrating that tactical mobility combined with a high-velocity gun could overcome thick German armor, even if the vehicle itself was fragile. However, its highly specialized nature, lack of infantry support capability, and open-topped vulnerability prevented it from taking a higher spot on a list evaluating overall operational effectiveness. The Hellcat proved that high speed was a lethal weapon in the sprawling fields and ruined towns of Europe. But in another theater of the war, high-velocity anti-tank guns and top speeds meant absolutely nothing if a vehicle could not traverse the terrain. Number 2 is the M3 and M5 Stuart light tank series. On paper, it might seem absurd to rank a light tank armed with a diminutive 37mm gun above the high-velocity Hellcat or the heavily armed Lee. In the European theater, the Stuart's light armor and small main gun quickly rendered it obsolete for direct tank-versus-tank combat. When the M3 Stuart first saw combat with the British in North Africa during Operation Crusader in late 1941, the results against superior German armor and anti-tank screens were often poor. By 1943, the 37mm gun was nearly useless against the frontal armor of upgraded German tanks. German troops dismissively called these small weapons door knockers, joking that the rounds only served to announce the American tank's presence. Consequently, in Europe, the Stuart was relegated to reconnaissance and screening missions, instructed to actively avoid heavy enemy armor whenever possible. But to understand the true lethality of the Stuart, the analysis must look to the Pacific. Here, the M3 and its improved derivative, the M5, became indispensable weapons of war. In the brutal, close-quarters jungle warfare of islands like Guadalcanal, the combat dynamics shifted entirely. The Imperial Japanese Army did not possess heavy armor, and the dense jungle terrain often negated the advantage of long-range anti-tank guns. The environment was a kingdom of rot, where heavy European-style tanks would simply bog down in massive shell craters, bottomless mud, and rotting vegetation. The Stuart's lightweight design allowed it to operate exactly where heavier vehicles could not. Furthermore, the M3 and M5 were mechanically brilliant. Early in the war, the British had affectionately nicknamed the tank the Honey because of its smooth ride and exceptional reliability. In the Pacific, the Stuart faced a terrifying form of warfare. Japanese infantry lacked effective man-portable anti-tank weapons like the bazooka, relying instead on suicidal swarming tactics. Soldiers would charge out of the dense jungle, attempting to climb directly onto the tanks to plant explosive charges or pry open hatches. In these desperate, claustrophobic engagements, the Stuart's 37mm gun proved devastating. The crew's frequently loaded canister shot, essentially transforming the main gun into a giant shotgun firing hundreds of lethal steel balls at point-blank range. A verified account from the Battle of the Tenaru on Guadalcanal in August 1942 illustrates this brutal reality. When Marine Stuart tanks were sent into a coconut grove to clear out elite Japanese infantry, the situation devolved into chaotic close-quarters combat. A Marine commander, fearing the tanks would be swarmed and destroyed with no way to rescue the isolated crews, radioed an order to withdraw. The tank commander, Lieutenant Leo Case, snapped back over the radio. "Leave us alone. We are too busy killing Japs." The Stuarts continued to blast through the enemy, physically running over the dead and wounded, using their tracks, machine guns, and canister shot to break the Japanese assault. After the battle, Marine General Alexander Vandegrift grimly remarked that the blood-coated tanks looked like meat grinders. The Stuart ranked second because, while severely outgunned in Europe, it was the exact right tool for the Pacific. It was fast, incredibly reliable, and mechanically tough enough to survive the harshest environments on Earth, remaining in frontline service through to the end of the war and directly saving the lives of thousands of American infantrymen. The Stuart was a masterpiece of mechanical reliability, and the Hellcat a marvel of lethal speed, but neither possessed the all-around capability to win a global mechanized war on multiple fronts. The ultimate position requires a tank that combined the heavy firepower of the Lee, the reliability of the Stuart, and the mass production capability of American industry. And finally, number 1, the deadliest American tank of World War II, is the M4 Sherman. Immediately, this ranking will spark debate. How can the M4 Sherman rank above a vehicle like the M26 Pershing, which boasted much thicker armor and a massive 90mm gun? How can it rank first when it is so often remembered by the controversial myth of being a death trap or a Ronson that easily burst into flames? To understand why the Sherman is number 1, the complete operational system must be examined. Lethality is not determined by a sterile one-on-one duel on a testing ground. The Pershing was indeed a more powerful tank in a direct fight. As established in the cold open, Sergeant Bob Early's Pershing flawlessly destroyed a Panther in Cologne. Later in April 1945, an experimental Super Pershing prototype, fitted with an elongated, high-velocity 90mm gun and crude-spaced armor cut from a destroyed German Panther, engaged and defeated a fearsome German King Tiger at Dessau in a brief, brutal duel. During this encounter, Gunner Corporal John Jack Irwin fired an armor-piercing round that penetrated the Tiger's underbelly, resulting in a catastrophic explosion. These were magnificent technical achievements for American armor, but the Pershing arrived too late. Only a few hundred saw combat before the war in Europe ended. A technologically superior tank has zero strategic influence if it is not present on the battlefield when it is needed most. The M4 Sherman, by contrast, was everywhere. With nearly 50,000 units produced, it was the absolute backbone of the Allied armored forces. But quantity alone does not equal lethality. The Sherman's true lethality lay in its unmatched reliability, its ease of repair, and its continuous evolution. The persistent myths surrounding the Sherman require careful examination. The popular claim that it took exactly 5 Shermans to destroy one Panther is a post-war exaggeration, based loosely on the doctrinal fact that American tank platoons traditionally operated in groups of 5. While early Sherman models with dry ammunition storage were prone to catching fire when penetrated by high-velocity rounds, American engineers actively solved the problem. They introduced wet stowage, surrounding the ammunition bins with a mixture of water and antifreeze, drastically reducing the fire rate upon penetration. Furthermore, the Sherman featured spring-loaded escape hatches and a spacious interior. If a Sherman was knocked out, the crew had a statistically higher chance of surviving and escaping than crews in many competing tanks. Furthermore, a damaged Sherman was rarely a dead Sherman. Because of highly standardized interchangeable parts, American maintenance teams could recover a knocked-out tank from the battlefield, wash out the interior, weld a steel patch over the armor penetration, drop in a fresh engine block, and have the vehicle fighting again in days. In combat, the Sherman was incredibly versatile. Its gyrostabilizer allowed the gunner to keep the weapon relatively steady while moving, a rare and advanced feature for the era. While the original 75mm gun struggled against the thick frontal armor of a Tiger or Panther, it was superb at firing high explosive shells to eliminate infantry, anti-tank guns, and concrete bunkers, which constituted the vast majority of targets American tankers actually faced. When heavier German armor became a severe threat, the Sherman adapted. Later variants, such as the Easy 8, were upgraded with wider tracks for better flotation in mud, improved suspension, and a high-velocity 76mm gun that could punch through German medium armor. The Sherman's lethality is best embodied by the verified human story of Staff Sergeant Lafayette G. Poole. Known as War Daddy, Poole commanded 3 different Sherman tanks, 1 standard M4A1 and 2 76mm variants, all famously named In the Mood. Operating with the 3rd Armored Division in France, Poole and his crew fought as the spearhead of 21 full-scale attacks over just 83 days in combat. Together with his driver, Wilbert Red Richards, and his gunner, Willis Aller, Poole's crew destroyed an astonishing 258 enemy vehicles, including at least 3 Panthers. They killed over 1,000 enemy soldiers and took 250 prisoners. Poole's gunner, Aller, was so relentless that it was said he saw all of France through his gun sight, his face permanently marked by the soot of his tanker's goggles. Poole's incredible run only ended in September 1944 when his final tank was ambushed by a Panther at the Siegfried Line in Münsterbusch, resulting in the loss of his right leg, though he survived the war. Poole and his crew proved that a well-trained, aggressive American team in a reliable, fast-firing Sherman could consistently outfight heavier German armor. The M4 Sherman ranks first because of this unparalleled combination of factors. It was tactically flexible, logistically brilliant, ergonomically designed for excellent crew communication via radio, and adaptable to every theater of the war, from the frozen Ardennes to the Pacific Islands. It was the total weapon system that won the war. When the finalists are compared directly, the picture of American armored lethality becomes clear. If the ranking were based strictly on sheer anti-tank firepower, the 90mm gun of the late-arriving M26 Pershing might easily take the crown. If it were based purely on speed and the ability to outflank the enemy, the M18 Hellcat would win every time. But Deadliest in a global war encompasses far more than a single technical specification. The M4 Sherman was not technically superior to every competing tank in every category. It did not have the thickest armor, nor did it carry the largest gun. But its combination of availability, mechanical endurance, and operational versatility made it a weapon of mass strategic influence. A German Tiger tank was a terrifying opponent in a direct duel, but its complex engineering made it a logistical nightmare, often resulting in breakdowns on the side of the road before it ever reached the battlefield. The Sherman, supported by an army of mechanics, recovery teams, and endless spare parts, ensured that American armored pressure was constant, reliable, and inescapable. Ultimately, tanks did not fight as isolated machines on a blank chessboard. Their effectiveness depended on the courage and skill of the crews operating them, the radio operators coordinating attacks, the infantry screening their flanks against ambushes, the artillery providing fire support, and the industrial workers back home who built them. The image of Corporal Clarence Smoyer in his Pershing, looking down the barrel of a German Panther in Cologne, remains a powerful testament to American armored capability. He survived and won that duel because of his intensive training, his crew's coordination, and the advanced technology finally reaching the front. But the reason his armored division was sitting in the heart of Germany in March 1945, poised to end the war, was because tens of thousands of reliable, adaptable M4 Shermans had carried the Allied armies from the beaches of Normandy, across France, and through the Siegfried Line. A technical chart can measure millimeter thickness and muzzle velocity, but it cannot measure strategic impact. By examining the complete operational picture, the logistics, the reliability, and the human beings inside the steel, the evidence indicates that the deadliest tank is not always the one that wins the duel. The deadliest tank is the one that guarantees victory in the war.